Let's start with something uncomfortable, not controversial, not ideological, just uncomfortable. For most of modern history, there has been an idea we're all supposed to believe in, an idea that sits at the center of global politics, international law, and diplomacy. The idea is simple, that the world is governed by rules, that borders mean something, that sovereignty matters, that no country, no matter how powerful, can simply take another one by force. And every time something like this happens, every time a powerful country crosses that line, we're told the same thing. This is an exception. This is unique. This is necessary. This won't happen again. But then it does. And this time, it happened in Venezuela. In early January 2026, the United States launched a direct military operation against Venezuela. Not sanctions, not covert pressure, not political recognition games, military force, airstrikes, special forces, a captured head of state. Within hours, Nicolás Maduro was no longer in Caracas. He was in U.S. custody. And within days, the President of the United States was saying, openly, on camera, that America would now run the country. No euphemisms, no diplomatic language, just power, stated plainly. And if that sentence alone doesn't stop you for a moment, it probably should. Because what happened next wasn't just about Venezuela. It wasn't just about oil, and it wasn't just about one administration. It was about the quiet collapse of an idea we've been pretending still exists, that international order actually constrains the powerful. To understand how we got here, you have to zoom out, way out. Because Venezuela didn't suddenly become vulnerable in January 2026, and the United States didn't suddenly become capable of doing this. This was decades in the making. Venezuela, for years, had been in slow-motion collapse, economic freefall, hyperinflation, mass migration, political repression, international isolation. Sanctions tightened, diplomatic pressure increased, opposition movements rose and fell, but nothing truly changed. And from the outside, especially in Washington, Venezuela began to look less like a sovereign state and more like a failed system waiting to be reorganized. That's the language empires always use. Not, we want control, but they can't govern themselves. And here's the important part. When a country becomes weak enough, isolated enough, divided enough, its sovereignty becomes theoretical. On paper, Venezuela was still a state. In reality, it was exposed, and exposure is an invitation. The justification came wrapped in legality. U.S. officials framed the operation as law enforcement, not war. Charges, indictments, narco-terrorism, accountability. But that framing matters less than the method. Because the moment soldiers cross borders without consent, the moment a leader is captured by a foreign military and removed from power, we are no longer in the world of law. We're in the world of force, and force has its own rules. This isn't the first time the United States has done this. Not even close. In 1989, Panama, Manuel Noriega, invasion, capture, trial in Miami. Before that, Guatemala, Chile, Dominican Republic, Haiti, Nicaragua. Sometimes openly, sometimes covertly, sometimes with tanks, sometimes with money and pressure. And each time, the same logic applied. This government is illegitimate, dangerous, criminal, or unstable. Therefore, intervention is justified. But here's what's different about Venezuela. This time, there was no real attempt to hide it. No coalition of the willing. No prolonged UN debate. No pretense of multilateral approval. Just a statement of reality. The United States could do this, so it did. And that's why this moment matters. Because it exposes something we usually pretend not to see. International institutions do not restrain power. They decorate it. Take the United Nations. After the invasion, Statements poured out. Concern, alarm, calls for restraint, urging respect for sovereignty. You've heard it all before, but nothing changed. No enforcement mechanism was triggered. No meaningful consequence followed. No force countered force. Because the UN was never designed to stop its most powerful members. It was designed to manage them. And when one of those powers decides it doesn't want to be managed, the system goes quiet. That silence is the sound of irrelevance. The same applies to international law. On paper, this intervention violates the UN Charter. On paper, it undermines sovereignty. On paper, it sets a dangerous precedent. But paper doesn't stop missiles. Law only works when backed by power, and global law has none of its own. Which brings us to the uncomfortable truth at the center of all this. The world is not ruled by rules. It is ruled by capability. Strong nations don't break international law. They redefine its limits. Weak nations don't violate sovereignty. They lose it. And Venezuela lost it the moment it became strategically useful and structurally defenseless at the same time. Oil matters here. Of course it does. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves on Earth. And for years, those reserves were locked behind sanctions, mismanagement, and political hostility. Suddenly, with Maduro gone, those barriers looked temporary. U.S. officials talked about rebuilding, stabilization, management, investment. But notice the language again. Not returning control. Not restoring sovereignty. Running the country. That phrase alone tells you everything you need to know. This wasn't a police action. It wasn't humanitarian. It wasn't accidental. It was structural power asserting itself in a moment of opportunity. And here's where the story stops being about America alone. Because every other major power is watching. China is watching. Russia is watching. Regional powers are watching. And they are learning a lesson. Not the lesson that international law is sacred, but the lesson that force still works. That if you are strong enough, fast enough, and decisive enough, the global reaction will be noise, not resistance. Condemnations fade, news cycles move on, reality settles. And once reality settles, precedent hardens. This is how norms die. Not with explosions, but with acceptance. Think about the message this sends to weaker states. Your independence is conditional. Your sovereignty lasts only as long as it aligns with the interests of someone stronger. And if you fall far enough behind, economically, militarily, diplomatically, your borders become negotiable. Now think about what this does to the future. If the U.S. can remove a government in Venezuela and face no real consequence, what stops another power from doing the same elsewhere? If law enforcement logic can justify invasion, why wouldn't others use it? This isn't a return to the Cold War. It's something colder. A world where power no longer pretends to justify itself morally, only practically. Where the language of rules exists mainly to discipline the weak. And where global institutions exist mostly to manage reactions, not outcomes. You might hear people say, but Maduro was a dictator. And that may be true. But here's the dangerous part of that argument. Once legitimacy becomes subjective, sovereignty becomes optional. Who decides which leaders deserve removal? Who decides which crimes justify invasion? Who enforces consistency? The answer, increasingly, is simple. Whoever can. And once that becomes the operating logic of the world, we are no longer living in an international order. We are living in a hierarchy. At the top, a handful of states with the ability to project force globally. Below them, states whose survival depends on alignment. And at the bottom, states whose internal collapse makes them available. Venezuela didn't just fall into crisis. It fell out of protection. So what happens next? In the short term, instability, power vacuums, uncertain governance, resistance movements. Occupation is never as clean as intervention looks on television. In the medium term, normalization, oil flows, interim authorities, diplomatic fatigue, the world adapts. And in the long term, this moment will be remembered not because Venezuela was invaded, but because nothing stopped it. Because after decades of claiming the world had moved past empire, empire stopped pretending it had left. This is not the end of international law, but it is the moment many stopped believing it applies equally. And once belief fades, enforcement collapses. What we are watching is not chaos. It's clarity. A reminder that power never disappeared. It just learned new language. And now, that language is wearing thin.